It will come as no surprise to anyone that the pirate profession was one of the most dangerous walks of life in the age of sail. The inevitable skirmish by land or sea was highly probable to result in your death or wounding by bullets, splinters, or sharp steel. In your everyday shipboard life, you might be burned in a gunpowder accident, fall from a mast, have your skull fractured from a loose block, or get bitten by a crocodile. That's not to mention the countless diseases spread by the tropical climate and poor hygiene, the likes of scurvy, yellow fever, malaria, and smallpox. Having a surgeon aboard was an absolute necessity. And contrary to derisive nicknames from the 19th century, the likes of Butcher or Sawbones, the 18th century surgeon found much respect aboard a pirate ship. In an age before antiseptics, antibiotics, and proper anesthesia, the surgeon's skills were critical. The key to this talent was education. Firstly, it should be noted that a surgeon was only ever called Mr., not Doctor, a title reserved for the more educated physicians. You see, the medical profession in Europe was divided into several colleges, in which the prestigious physicians were the most educated and pretentious. Though they looked down upon their medical cousins, the barbers, apothecarians, and surgeons, they couldn't possibly tend to all of Europe's medical needs on their own. In the year 1700, the city of London had over 1,000 apothecarians, but only 60 physicians. The situation was much the same at sea, with actual physicians being quite rare. Still, pirates had a hard time distinguishing between the two professions. Sea journals and articles of agreement often referred to him as a doctor, regardless if he was actually educated as a physician or simply a surgeon. They probably didn't care, as long as you gave them their medicine, preferably a large spoonful of anesthesia. The key to any medical education was understanding humerology, the dominant medical theory of the pre-industrial era. It was an ancient belief which claimed that the body was governed by 4 substances: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. The key to good health laid in the balance of your humors. For example, to maintain your black bile, you might be prescribed a certain bread. The most infamous example laid in bloodletting. This was the act of cutting open a vein and bleeding the patient of however much blood the surgeon found necessary. It was a cure-all used for everything from gout to combat wounds. So if you were bleeding, you might have to bleed some more. Now, I talked a lot about physicians and surgeons, so you might wonder what the difference was. The physician received an academic education. The surgeon learned his craft through a 7-year apprenticeship. Many sea surgeons even received their apprenticeship aboard an actual ship, sometimes a pirate ship. Alexander Exquemelin began his Caribbean life as an indentured servant to a cruel master. He was eventually sold to a much kinder patron, a surgeon. After a year had passed, the surgeon offered Exquemelin his freedom, provided the young man would pay a compensation when he had the money. Exquemelin agreed, and he had learned enough from his master to sign aboard a Buccaneer ship as a surgeon. In 1674 he returned to Amsterdam, finding employ in the Surgeons' Guild, his years of mending the Buccaneers seemingly qualifying as a sufficient apprenticeship. Other Buccaneer surgeons were made so by circumstance. In 1687, Mr. Henry Pittman was convicted of treason after having tended to the wounds of English rebels. He was deported as an indentured servant to Barbados. He and his compatriots escaped and had no choice but to turn Buccaneer. We can assume that most Buccaneer surgeons in the 1600s turned to their craft from a lust for money and adventure. They were men like Lionel Wafer, who traveled twice into South America with the ambitions to seize gold and silver. Or the scrupulous Dr. Thomas Dover, yes, an actual physician, who signed aboard Woodes Rogers' privateering cruise to the far side of the world. Rogers himself was unfortunately catapulted into bankruptcy, whereas Dover had enough money to afford a holiday across Europe. What all of these men had in common, aside from their violent environments, were that they were all intellectuals that published their own written, unique works. Exquemelin is probably the most famous. His exaggerated history of the Buccaneers laid the modern foundation for our understanding of pirates. Henry Pittman wrote an account of his torturous misadventures, which served as an inspiration for Hollywood movies like the 1935 Captain Blood adaptation. And Captain Blood paved the way for a movie more familiar to most of you, Pirates of the Caribbean. Lionel wrote a scientific journal of his stay in Darien, which had the butterfly effect of England uniting with Scotland and forming Great Britain. What about Dr. Dover? He invented Dover's powder, a cure for the fever and common cold, which could be prescribed from apothecaries until the 1960s. In short, these roguish healers had a profound effect on our modern world. The respect which pirates offered their surgeons allowed them the freedom to live whatever life they pleased. They received a higher payment than the average pirate. If they wanted, they could drink themselves into a stupor, or document the exotic beasts and botany. Their respect and their inherent authority often turned them into powerful officers. Some would, inevitably, abuse their position. Take the adventure galley, for example. Captain Kidd kept his store of rum and wine under lockdown, and only accessible to him, the steward, and the surgeon. Alcohol was the only available anesthesia, so Mr. Badingham always administered his patients with a spoonful of cordials before their bloody operations. That was when Badingham wasn't drunk on the cordials himself. When he wasn't aboard the ship, he spent most of his time in a drinking house on Madagascar. Another pirate surgeon was known as John Death. He once ordered his men to haul the china dishes of a captured ship and load them into cannons. A Buccaneer doctor could live whatever life he pleased, but by the turn of the century, it just wasn't worth it anymore. Maritime laws had tightened, and if you were so much as suspected of piracy, you were hanged. The old days in which buccaneers could burn a city and get away with a slap on the wrist were over. Surgeons would no longer sign aboard pirate ships, willingly. So pirates had to force them, at gunpoint. Their injuries wouldn't go anywhere unless treated, and these were men that took what they needed. But this didn't mean that surgeons were abused. Indeed, a captured surgeon of any kind could always expect good treatment. When 3 pirate surgeons were captured in the town of Arica, they weren't executed like their shipmates, but embraced by the Spanish. They were forced to heal the wounded Spaniards, and one account remarked that the local women were especially kind to them. Pirates employed a special system for managing their surgeons. As soon as they captured a surgeon, they forced him into service. But whenever they got the opportunity to acquire a new surgeon, they would let their old one go scot-free, provided he wished to leave. But it's not like this surgeon ever really got much from it. Kidnapped surgeons weren't so keen on the inevitable hanging that awaited most pirates, so most of them refused to take any shares of the plunder. If a witness saw you taking a slice of stolen goods, it would be used against you in court. Pirates understood this, so they never forced their surgeons to sign the Articles of Agreement. This would have been further evidence of their complicitness. So most surgeons were able to prove their innocence. Basically, the pirates did everything they could to keep their surgeons appeased. Your life may depend on his kindness, after all. And many surgeons did it out of the kindness in their heart and their dedication to the Hippocratic Oath. But whether the surgeon had signed aboard willingly or not, was a budding author or an abusive drunk, a coward or an officer to rival the captain himself, their duties and organization remained largely the same throughout the entire Golden Age. A pirate company didn't have just one surgeon, but several. One of them was elected as master surgeon by the company. He received a higher payment, authority, and if the company had more than one ship, he was always kept aboard the flagship. Aside from bossing over the lesser surgeons, termed surgeons' mates, one of his most important duties was maintaining the medicine chest. This mysterious container was one of the most valuable items found aboard any ship. They held within them the key to life and death, in the form of strange medicaments, the likes of liquids, powders, salves and syrups, all named in Latin, surely impressive to the barely literate sailor. They could contain esoteric substances like liquid amber, or mundane things like currants. The effectiveness of these medicines could be questioned, and apothecarians were often ridiculed for their absurd treatments and medicines. For a pirate surgeon, plunder was the principal way of maintaining a well-stocked medicine chest. One of the missions in Assassin's Creed 4 involves you as a player using a diving bell to recover the medicine chest from a shipwreck. If you'd like to experience the adventures of this game for yourself, I'd highly suggest you purchase it via Instant Gaming. I partnered up with Instant Gaming for 2 reasons. One, it is a service I use myself, so I can attest to its quality. Secondly, I use it because it offers the best discounts for games. Let's take a look. Assassin's Creed 4, 84% off. If you follow the link to their site in the video description and buy a game from it, I will earn a cut of the profits. So you'll get a great game, support my channel and Instant Gaming. If you decide to buy something, please enjoy your game. But remember to play in moderation. Thank you to Instant Gaming. When we think pirate surgeon, we think trepanning or amputation. But his everyday routine consisted of more mundane tasks. Applying plasters, shaving beards, cutting hair, and tending to the sick. Minor bruises, scratches, sores, and wounds were a daily occurrence on a sailing ship. These were mended by applying plasters. The current picture shows the type of plaster box used by sea surgeons. The surgeon cut the plaster himself into whatever shape was appropriate for the wounded area. As you can see on this picture, there were round, square, triangular, and even crescent plasters. Some contained adhesives and would stick to the skin, others had to be kept in place with a bandage. Imagine doing this daily on man after man on a ship full of hundreds of men. One assistant compared it to slavery. Shaving yourself before the advent of the Gillette's razor was a process which few men had the stomach to undertake. Razors were expensive, and the learning curve was steep and pocked by plenty of cuts on your face and fingers. Most sailors relied on their surgeon to shave them about 2 times a week. The image of a bearded pirate is largely a 19th century invention, which wanted to portray the sea rover as a social outcast. Period illustrations and written descriptions indicate that sailors and pirates preferred to maintain clean shaves. One privateer company were described as looking like young boys, owing to the, quote, artificial smoothness of their faces. Neither were these men fresh from London. They were roving in the Pacific Ocean and had recently endured a shipwreck. Were there exceptions? Sure, there always are. I shouldn't have to mention it. And this is a video about surgeons, not about beards. The sickly were either designated to a special hospital ship or a quarantined area of the vessel, called the sick bay. They were given special food, like rice with butter or coconut milk. It was the surgeon's duty to tend to them at least twice a day. I actually made an entire video about hygiene and toilets on a pirate ship. It also contains a section on how the sickly were treated. I suggest you give it a look. If a sailor was struck by a serious malady, the surgeon might be obligated to cure it with one of his arcane methods. One of them was to place a plaster to force the growth of a blister. Blisters were believed to be ill humors escaping your body. Another popular method was cupping. You might have entertained yourself once or twice by taking like a thimble or something and sticking it to your skin by drawing out the air. Cupping worked under a similar principle. A glass cup was applied close to the selected area until a bulge formed in the skin. The bulge was then hacked with a small tool and bled into the glass cup until it stopped bleeding. It was the same principle as bloodletting. It was believed that a sick person could be cured by being relieved of excess blood. Syringes. They can be found in pretty much every shipwreck, including Blackbeard's. These were used for cleaning wounds, but mostly against venereal diseases like gonorrhea or syphilis. Known as the pox in the period, syphilis was treated by sticking a syringe into your urethra and pumping it with a solution of mercury. This liquid metal is far from wholesome. Many believe that the erratic behavior of pirates could be attributed to syphilis, and especially its detrimental treatment. Other diseases had more reasonable treatments. It was widely recognized that fresh fruit was good against scurvy, though no one really understood why exactly until the mid-1700s. The surgeon operated out of a special cabin called the cockpit in English, or fosse à lion in French, the lion's den. It was situated in the back of the lower decks below the waterline, making them safe from cannon fire. The cockpit was situated close to a hatchway so that the wounded could easily be carried down during battle. It was a cramped little space where the surgeon stored all of his tools, medicines, plasters, and where he had to operate during combat. Outside of combat, it might have been preferable to operate on the open deck, where you had access to better lighting. Before the battle, a diligent surgeon spent his time preparing the deck for surgery. The operating table was laid out and covered with a canvas, and seats or rolls of canvas were prepared for the inevitable waiting line. Buckets of water were set out, and the floor of the cockpit covered with sand or sawdust to prevent the surgeon from slipping in blood. In a climate like the Caribbean, the cramped cockpit would have been hot, only amplified by scores of screaming, wounded men. The many ways in which to hurt yourself in ship combat were legion. Lacerations from swords, penetration by bullets, broken bones from cudgels and falling spars. Gunpowder burns could scorch the skin right off your flesh, but the biggest cause of death, wounds and maiming were splinters. When a cannonball pierced the side of your ship, you were less likely to be hit by the ball itself, more so by the cloud of razor-sharp splinters it would send flying through the air. Captain Woods Rogers was wounded by a splinter in his heel, and he had to walk with a cane for the rest of his life. In the best of cases, the wounds were so slight that the wounded could get right back into the fight. Foreign objects were removed, wounds patched up with plasters or bandages. In the worst of cases, a serious operation had to be undertaken. Surgery was quite advanced in the period. There were methods of eye surgery and even ways to operate the brain. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with trepanning, the act of making an incision into the head in order to mend a skull fracture. The method is quite ancient, dating back to the Stone Age. What wasn't as advanced was anesthesia, making the procedure horribly painful and brutal. You'd be given a few drops of rum, but not enough to make you drunk. Laudanum, a form of opiate, was available but expensive. Patients had to be bound to their chair or bench, held down by their shipmates, and made to bite into a bullet or other object. Next, the surgeons cut into your flesh. Critical bleeding in a limb was stopped with tourniquets, a twisting device still in use today, which is supposed to hurt more than a gunshot. Wounds were soon shot or cauterized. It isn't necessarily true that pirate surgeons were poorly sanitized. Manuals recommended that you'd clean your tools and hands, and Lionel Wafer wrote how he kept his tools in an oiled cloth to protect them from rusting. Even then, the risk of infection was much higher than today. The first operation might be a failure and require a second attempt, your chance of death increasing with every visit to the cockpit. Even so, pirate surgeons appear to have been very capable. From the 40 or so Buccaneers wounded in the 1680 battle near Panama, only 2 died after treatment. The idea of pirates wearing eye patches and peg legs isn't a myth. These sorts of injuries were very common. There weren't any hook hands, but some people could afford wooden hands. And if a pirate received a serious injury, it wasn't the end of the world. He'd be paid a compensation in money or slaves. And if he wished to continue sailing as a pirate, he might find employ in a less violent part of the ship, like the cook room, or playing music for the company, provided he wasn't deaf from all the cannon fire. When the battle was over, the wounded men were moved to their hammocks or the sick bay. The slighter wounds were tended to, the cockpit scrubbed clean of blood, and amputated limbs thrown into the sea. A welcoming meal for the finned stowaways, certainly stocking your ship. But what happened in the worst case, if there wasn't any surgeon available? They might assign someone else to the role. Typically, the captain was held responsible. Another likely candidate was the carpenter. One account described the pirate carpenter aboard Captain Phillips' ship. After being ordered to amputate a man's leg, the carpenter took his biggest saw and severed the leg like a plank. Next, he took his axe, heated it red hot in a fire, and cauterized the wound. The cauterization was done so poorly that the leg may have been mortified. But as was the case with many treatments in the period, experienced surgeon or not. Quote, "Nature performed a cure at last, without any other assistance." An individual pirate may tend to his own wounds with crude and dangerous methods. You could stuff an eye socket with oakum, much like the leeks in woodwork. Candle tallow could be used as a salve for burns, and a mixture of brandy and butter as a liniment for bruises. In movies and video games, we might see a wound cauterized with gunpowder. Neither modern nor contemporary gunpowder burns hot enough to do that. If you had the means to ignite gunpowder, you had the means of starting a fire, heating up a knife, and cauterizing yourself the correct way. A pirate may do anything in his might to get well from a disease. It was said that mother's milk could cure the bloody flux. Captain Kidd's brother-in-law was found suckling on the breast of a nursing Malagasy woman. William Dampier, the botanist Buccaneer, was well known for his good health, but even he would fall sick on occasion. At one point he tried bloodletting himself with a pencil, but it wasn't sharp enough. In another incident, he wanted to try sweating himself as a cure. This was a popular method back in Europe. You might be given special food to induce sweat. Dampier buried himself in the hot sand on a tropical beach. And according to him, it actually worked. Placebo effect? Maybe. Huge thanks to my generous channel members and Patreon supporters. In particular, Cole Freer, Max Dweck, 1660, Michaela Jans, Daniel Stryker, Sea-Dog, Randall DeVere, Old Man Said, Krillov, and Nick Hooper. If you'd like to interact with me or fellow pirate enthusiasts, please check out the link to our Discord server in the video description. Hope to see you there. Cheers!